This is Sarah Jones on the Politicus Pod for Politicus USA's The Daily. Have you noticed how establishment media doesn't label January 6th a domestic terrorist attack, in spite of FBI Director Wray's specifically labeling it as such? Or maybe the way social media goes out of its way to appease Republicans who violate its rules, only to have them turn around and accuse the same media of catering to liberals. It's called working the ref. Republicans have been doing this for decades, accusing the media of being liberal, even as the media has been consolidated by right-wing power brokers, billionaires, and far-right demagogues. In order to appease the right, media enforcement has to gaslight the rest of us about what are known facts and obvious threats to our own safety, including the proliferation of gun fetishizing incels, racially radicalized failures intent on harming people of color to excuse their own inadequacies, and anti-government terrorists who are so angry about being asked to wear a thin paper mask that they plot to kidnap Michigan's governor. We might note that many of these same types also identify as Trumpsies, and they were represented on January 6th, and many were wearing a mask, but this time they were wearing it to hide their identity. Apparently that doesn't make them so angry that they need to plot to kill whoever planned January 6th. The recent far-right attempt to elevate the Twitter files to mean the opposite of what the evidence provided suggested worked insofar as it sucked up all the oxygen out of the room, and it seemed that few noticed the story being told by the evidence, and so conservatives are nursing their self-pity and their victim status in what is a typical abuse manipulation tactic comprised of deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. It's called DARVO, for those who don't know. They do it because it works. It works on establishment corporate media, and it works on establishment corporate social media. Tech Dirt pointed out that what we learned is that Trump and other Republican leaders were actually given special treatment over the years because they tended to violate policies way more than Democrats. But knowing that Republicans would flop to the ground and fake injury anytime they were faced with even having to take the slightest bit of responsibility for violating policies, all of the big social media platforms went above and beyond to better protect the high-profile accounts of Republican rule breakers. Do you want more blood on your hands? A Twitter safety employee asked a top Twitter executive, Del Harvey, when Harvey questioned whether Trump could inspire more violence in the insurrection's aftermath. The exchange, relayed by former Twitter employees to the January 6th committee, was included in a summary of investigation findings prepared by committee staff and obtained by Rolling Stone, which they note most of which were not included in the committee's final report. And I want to highlight that for you because that's the point of what we're doing here today. Most of this was not included in the committee's final report. Now, barely anyone is paying attention to the committee's report, let alone what was left out of the committee's report. Rolling Stone reported Twitter reportedly told the committee that it instituted the draft coded incitement to violence policy once rioters made it inside the Capitol. But former employees said the on-the-fly implementation was vague, confused, and ad hoc, The result of the delay, they argued, meant that members of the safety policy team were manually taking down violent tweets, including hashtag execute Mike Pence, using only the Twitter search function. The sheer scale of Republican post-election rage paralyzed decision-makers at Twitter and Facebook who feared political reprisals if they took strong action. That's the end of the from Rolling Stone. In a jointly published Just Security and Tech Policy press piece, they added context for what didn't make it into that report that Rolling Stone obtained. Investigators wrote that right-wing networks played a key role in driving the spread of content behind the attack. This is a quote. While Trump played an instrumental role in driving the attack, right-wing networks comprised of everyone from mainstream talking heads to extreme armed groups drove the mass spread of conspiracy theories and far-right content on social media. That spread could not have occurred without corporate policies of social media platforms and other enterprises that allowed dangerous rhetoric to proliferate online and ultimately contribute to violence in the real world. As investigators for the committee, we were charged with examining the role these factors played in the events of January 6th. In this essay, we aim to call attention to the role that social media activity irrefutably played in the insurrection and to highlight the continuing threats to American democracy, as well as to share lessons learned that may help prevent future political violence. That's the end of that quote, but we're going to go back to their report because there's a lot in it. We've been told that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube were just catering to their bottom line in allowing the proliferation of hate. But this additional reporting shows that it wasn't their profit they had in mind. You know what it was? It was fear of Republicans. And here's the quote. While it's possible that this is true more generally, that is that it was the profit as analysts have suggested before, our investigation found little direct evidence for this motivation in the context of the 2020 election. Advocates for bold action within these companies, such as Facebook's break glass measures or Twitter's policies for handling implicit incitement to violence, were more likely to meet resistance for political reasons than for explicitly financial ones. Okay, so why does that matter? Because even when Trump is gone, the rising threat of domestic terrorism won't go away. By focusing on Trump as the driver, the real power behind him, which is the elites who are also driving the Republican Party platform, get off scot-free to rinse and repeat. Just as Trump was a repeat on steroids of Sarah Palin's hate. And if you've listened to me before or you've read me over the past decade, I've been talking about this for over 10 years. So this isn't new. It's not new to Trump. And in fact, it's not even specific to America. There's a global right-wing push. And we see the results of that all over with the rising fascism and threats to small d democracy. So back to that report. While skeptics of social media's role in the attack might say that the causal relationship between these tools and the violence itself is tenuous, this is a straw man argument. Regardless of whether online activity is a direct cause of extremist violence, they write in this report, these investigators for the January 6th report, this is not included in that report, social media platforms are responsible for conducting due diligence against abuse of their services. Just highlight that, because if you're on any of these platforms, you're going to have people, even on the left, arguing that they couldn't possibly deal with all this, that due to free speech and all these other kind of straw man arguments, because these companies are not owned by the government. They're owned by corporations. Then they don't have an obligation to anyone to allow them to say whatever they want. And we see that with Elon Musk now, just saying you can't make fun of him. I mean, of course, he doesn't come out and admit that, but he bans people for making fun of him. And the response on the right has been, oh, well, he owns this platform. He can do whatever he wants. And that's true. He can. But let's extract that out. If we're going to have principles, they need to apply to everyone equally. So back to this report. And also, I apologize. My throat, the reason I have not done a podcast for the last week is I had COVID several years ago, and it stuck with me. So whenever I get anything else, the symptoms of COVID come back. And so my voice is a little still taking a hit from that, and you'll hear that off and on. But I'm feeling fine. It's just ongoing struggle. I do urge everyone to get vaccinated. So back to this report. The events of January 6th resulted from many interrelated factors, including increasingly radical rhetoric from leading conservative voices, both on and offline, and an alarming uptick in people who believe political violence to be a viable solution. These threats to U.S. democracy are likely to outlive Trump's political relevance, and they were not outside the purview of the committee. Our findings suggest that the intersection between social media and violent extremism remains pervasive and, in fact, a central component of the internet. And lastly, because facts matter, one clear conclusion from our investigation is that proponents of the recently released, quote, Twitter files, unquote, who claim that platform suspensions of the former president are evidence of anti-conservative bias, have it completely backward. Platforms did not hold Trump to a higher standard by removing his account after January 6th. Rather, for years, they wrote rules to avoid holding him and his supporters accountable. It took an attempted coup d'etat for them to change course. Evidence and testimony provided by members of Twitter's Trust and Safety team make it clear that those arguing Trump was held to an unfair double standard are willfully neglecting or overlooking the significance of January 6th in the context of his ban from major platforms. In the words of one Twitter employee who came forward to the committee, if Trump had been any other user on Twitter, he would have been permanently suspended a very long time ago. So that's the end of that quote from the report. Why is everyone pretending they don't smell the stench? Why did the committee leave this important context out? Why is our media pretending January 6th was a riot instead of domestic terrorism, other than to appease right-wingers? And, let's go back. This January 6th was labeled domestic terrorism by the head of the FBI. It used to be that whatever the FBI said, whatever law enforcement said, that's what the media would report. In fact, they do that when it comes to law enforcement's kind of claims about, we could go back to the Occupy movement, but anytime you see the people sort of engaging in what law enforcement doesn't like, the media will use their labels. We don't see extra context given. So I would like to highlight the fact that if we are too afraid to use the proper labels for things like domestic terrorism because they might offend people, we are incentivizing them to further political extremism and violence because it is working for them. Might I be so bold as to suggest that we instead incentivize them to stop committing acts of terrorism by not catering to their threats, by not giving them what they want and hoping they don't get angry? They're always angry. They're going to be angry and make accusations of bias no matter what. That's the nature of the beast. And what else comes to mind here is that for all of their accusations of liberals being snowflakes and their mocking of the use of pronouns, it is conservatives who are so sensitive about being labeled that our entire media structure is bending over backward to avoid the elephant in the room. Yes, using threats of violence to get a political outcome is domestic terrorism. We saw this with the Pelosi attack. We see this with the shooting into the offices in New Mexico, the Democratic Party offices. There are so many examples of this recently that it is beyond troubling that everyone in media is still catering to these folks. Using threats of violence to get a political outcome is domestic terrorism, end of. For the safety of all citizens, these people need to be held to account. Social media companies need to stop bending the rules to accommodate violent and dangerous rhetoric. The next time we meet here, we're going to dive into how law enforcement has obstructed attempts by lawmakers to get information about domestic terrorism. So I'm going to leave you with this thought today that when you see people claiming all this bias and there's this persecution complex that has really identified the right for decades now about the media, their media's working against them. They've been claiming this for decades. That is not only not true, but it's the opposite. It is the opposite. And now it's become so dangerous that it's enabling domestic terrorism. This is Sarah Jones on the Politicus Pod for Politicus USA's The Daily. If you are tired of billionaires controlling the news that you see and all of this gaming working the refs that I'm talking about, that doesn't happen at Politicus USA. It doesn't happen on Substack. If you want to be part of the movement to support news for the people, subscribe to our Substack. All of the sources for the podcast are on the Substack as well. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.